So I'm Dan Whaley. I'm a senior architect at the BBC in the Voice and AI team, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what we are up to in this space, what we've been doing for the last 18 months. I've called it the golden age of audio because there's an enormous amount going on in this space now. If you think about maybe the rise of podcasts, the rise of other types of audio content that is being produced and consumed is huge, and I think the interaction with voice makes this a really interesting space at the moment. And the BBC is as a main content contributor is getting really involved in this space. So, if you don't know who the BBC are, or maybe not quite sure exactly what we do, we are the world's oldest broadcaster. We have a global weekly audience reach of about 380 million. That's slightly more than Twitter. We have our own iPlayer, which is a video on demand service, gets something like 230 million requests per month in the UK, and we produce lots of content, lots of news content that you probably see around the world. But we do a lot of drama and film and other content too, which you might have seen on things like Netflix. We do lots of co-productions with people like that. So BBC Studios is a big producer of that kind of stuff. The BBC's kind of overall what we call our Reithian values. So the BBC was started by a guy called Lord Reith, and he gave us the mission to inform, educate, and entertain. So they've been our values since 1922, or our aim since 1922. And the editorial team at the BBC have given us this challenge, or asked this question. So how do we inform, educate, and entertain in a conversational medium? And there's a lot to unpack in that, and we'll try and do that to some extent today. But what that means is that we are on a journey towards creating an AI directed towards public service broadcasting. Now, in the beginning, the strategy is really around putting existing content onto these platforms. And we absolutely are there now. So if you ask for the BBC, you'll get BBC Radio, BBC Audio on Demand, etc. We can talk about that a bit in a minute. And then we're moving into creating kind of new style experiences. But the end game is really towards creating an AI for public service, taking our great content and maintaining our public service values. So, to answer that, the technologist question has been, how do we create a technology strategy that enables that type of conversation with the audience? And that will be kind of part of what I focus on today. But before we go there into kind of strategy and things like that, let's have a look at what we've been making over the past sort of 18 months. The original BBC foray into the voice platform was something called the Inspection Chamber. It was created by BBC R&D and released back in September 2017. This is a branching narrative style game. So many of you may have played. You're actually probably quite familiar with these ideas now. So if you've watched things like Netflix's Bandersnatch, or you used to play the games where you're reading a book and there would be decision points within that book, and you would then go to different points within the story in a kind of choose your own adventure style. This is a voice version of that. It's very high audio production quality, so it doesn't use Alexa's voice. It uses actors recorded in studios. But you make decisions about how that adventure will play out through the through voice on smart speakers and particularly on Alexa. So this is an experiment to understand if people are interested in lean-in experiences on voice. So long-form lean-in experiences rather than lean-back experiences where you might just select a radio station or select a podcast and just chill out and do the washing up or whatever. Or are there, and further experiments get into looking at whether this type of content will work or whether people are actually more interested in kind of very short-form audio in these type of situations. That actually got some great feedback from the British press, including from the Daily Mail. So if you're from the UK, you'll know the Daily Mail does not like the BBC, but even they gave us some really good feedback on the Inspection Chamber. So the main skill we have on Alexa is a thing called the BBC skill. This allows access to live radio, so we have something like 300 live radio stations across the UK. There's the kind of big ones like Radio 1, Radio 6, Radio 4 that you may have heard of, plus there are lots and lots of local radio stations, so all of those are accessible via Alexa and other smart speakers. We have a huge library of podcasts that gets added to on a daily basis, and you can access all of those. And then we have all of the catch-up radio, so audio on demand on there. So you can also do stuff like you can pause podcasts, you can resume podcasts, you can skip, you can ask what's playing, and it will give you some feedback on who the DJ is and what the particular song is and things like that. So this is really about that first step in that graph of just making the BBC available on these devices and making it a kind of uniform play. We think anecdotally that this is probably the biggest skill in the UK market on Alexa. We've even heard that Amazon take our numbers out of their numbers, otherwise it skews the data. So another thing that we've been trying is something called the CBeebies skill, which is for kind of small kids, 3 to 5-year-olds. Again, this is very high quality audio production, and we take BBC characters from your favorite CBeebies programs like Hey Dougie and Go Jetters, etc., and then create interactive games around that. So you can roar like a dinosaur, you can jump around, you can sing and dance, you can help chase a mouse around the room, all kinds of exciting stuff if you've got little kids. We've also included bedtime stories, which are hugely popular. So we have famous authors and famous actors reading stories. People like Dolly Parton are on there, which is a lovely way to hear a story. And we have a load of kind of songs you can sing along to and dance to, etc. So if you've got little kids and you're in the UK, ask Alexa to play CBeebies, and it will open up the skill, and it's great fun. We have lots of aims for this skill. We're going to grow it. We're going to potentially expand it into other markets, etc. And really one of our kind of key investments is how we do this. But this is a kind of key learning area for us. It gives us an area to experiment with different UI form factors. And again, it gives us a sense of how people interact across smart speakers, whether they want lean-in experiences or lean-back experiences. It's all accessed through the same skill, so you just open the CBeebies skill, and then there's some voice navigation to get you to the right part of the skill, and then onwards. Pleased to say that we were a Webby Awards winner with this skill too, just a couple of months ago. So the team were very pleased with that, and it just goes to show that that good quality audio production and good UI produces good experiences on voice. Another thing we've been doing is, again, this is an R&D thing, and again, another experiment to see if types of long-form audio work well on smart speakers. This is the thing called The Unfortunates, which was a story written in the 60s, it was written as a series of pamphlets. And those pamphlets don't have any order to them. So whenever you were supposed to pick up the pamphlets, shuffle the pamphlets and start reading. So we've replicated that on the smart speaker. Every time you open the Unfortunate skill, it shuffles the deck again, so you get the story in a different order, because there is no inherent order in the story, which makes it really quite a weird experience in some cases. And it's also very long. It takes 1 hour and 20 minutes to listen to it from one end to the other of this. And you might think, well, really? Why would you do that? But it's an experiment, again, to see if that kind of long-form audio works well for this type of platform. And the feedback is most people don't get to the end, I think, at the moment. But it's been quite interesting. And again, very high audio production. It's not using Alexa's voice. It's using Martin Freeman, who's a British actor who's reading most of the content. Our newest experiment has been with news. So news is obviously a really important thing for the BBC, and probably what international audiences experience most of the BBC. One of the things that we are experimenting with is an interactive news concept where you can you would get your kind of daily news update or multi times a day news update. And you can skip through segments. So you can say, okay, skip that segment, or skip that story within that segment, or tell me more about that story. So if you say skip, it moves on. If you say more, it gives you more information. If you say next section, you would get a story about, you move from talking about the national news to the local news to home, or to sport, or something like that. As an experiment, we ran this in India during the Indian elections. So this is important to us for a couple of reasons. One, it gives us a really interesting place to do a first experiment with that. But two, India is a really important place for the BBC to be present, and the World Service has been present in India for a long time. There is also a paucity of good quality information and news in India at the moment, and there is a lot of concern in India around fake news, and that gets spread through platforms like WhatsApp, etc. So putting a audio news service from a reliable source onto smartphones, we thought was a very important thing to experiment with. So we launched on the Google Assistant. You talk to it through your phone. So you find that in India there are a lot of people who have what we call a feature phone. So it is internet connected and has some functionality of a smartphone, but isn't a full smartphone capability. And there is already quite a lot of voice usage in that market. So people press the button and then talk to Google Assistant or whatever, and that gives them they use that for search and for various other things. If you saw the Google keynote at Google I/O, again they are very focused on creating more and more experiences that enable the Indian subcontinent to do more with their phones. So we launched this feature with 2 bulletins in Hindi. So it's in Hindi again, high production quality. It's not text-to-speech voices. It's real. There's a team in Delhi who create this stuff for us. And it's got a very kind of conversational tone to the narrative. So as you move through it, it moves like that. And these type of interactions are designed to kind of, to some extent, feel personalized, although at the moment, there isn't any personalization going on in that skill. So what you do is you open your English or Hindi version of the assistant, and you can navigate either in English or in Hindi, not both. But the content is only in Hindi. So you can say kind of back, next, etc. in English or Hindi, but the content is only in Hindi. So hopefully, if I press this, you'll get a bit of a sense of what that sounds like. No audio?
The BBC.
Let's go back.
Okay, let's get BBC elections.
The BBC.
नमस्कार, आपका स्वागत है बीबीसी के विशेष इलेक्शन बुलेटिन में, जिसे आप कंट्रोल कर सकते हैं। अगर आप अगली कहानी सुनना चाहते हैं, तो आप कह सकते हैं मूव ऑन।
So I don't know if anybody's Hindi was good enough to understand what was going on there, but basically that's the introduction to the skill, and it tells you how to navigate back and forward, etc. when you first open it like that. So what did we learn? One of the first things we learned was that actually in India, a lot of people have their phones set to English and Hindi, not a default to either one of those languages. And Google Assistant isn't very good at supporting that, so that was a bit problematic in the early days. And we had to get people have to have it set to one of the 2 languages to make that work well. You can't use the kind of Hinglish in very well in the Google Assistant. That didn't work too well. So you have to either speak in Hindi or in English to make the navigation work well. Sometimes people blend that, and that doesn't work too good. From an editorial perspective, the kind of the team in Delhi to some extent were a bit like the very traditional BBC, and it was a bit too formal in the first instance, and the way the content was produced didn't feel conversational enough, didn't feel chatty enough. It felt very BBC. And actually changing that and trying to get them to do stuff that was a bit more informal, again using English rather than necessarily English or Hindi, it was getting more at the kind of market segment we were after, and got more kind of positive feedback. There are also loads of other languages in India that obviously Hindi and English didn't address, and getting to some of those would be quite an interesting next step at looking how this worked. This was also only for the Indian elections, so all the content was specifically about the Indian elections. It wasn't kind of more generic content, and probably to drive more engagement, we need to have wider BBC content in there. But it was a very interesting experiment. So the other thing that we've been doing to support all of this development in voice is creating some of our own conversational experience tools, and most of that has been focused on a thing called Orator. And Orator is a branching narrative style piece of conversational tooling that we created for the purposes of building our own content on smart speakers. So you, as a non-technical person, as an editor, as a content producer, you can go into Orator, you can script your experience, you can add the pre-recorded WAV files, because we try and use that as much as possible rather than using the Alexa voice, and then you can export that. It produces a runtime that can be run by the platforms. So quickly moving on to some of the challenges that we have in bringing voice to these platforms that I think other people share. The first is that the current market is absolutely dominated by these two huge gorillas of Google and Alexa, and that means that there are a lot of issues around control. So who controls the experience? Who's in charge? Who's going to aggregate your content? Who's in charge of the user experience? With voice generally, there is, voice on these platforms, there is a big challenge between attribution of content and discovery and ease of use. So the platforms very much want us to just give them our content, so that you can just you can open up the smart speaker and just ask for a piece of content and it gets delivered. But then we lose a lot of attribution to the BBC and BBC value. One example of what we've done in that case is to make it easier for the end user is to take away the skill name. So when you wake up our skill, you can say, Alexa, ask the BBC to play Radio 6 music. But we've taken that away, and we've got what's called a direct integration, so Alexa, play Radio 6 music. That's great because it's easy to use, but it loses some of the attribution of content to us. For our main radio stations, that's not really a problem. It's very obvious you're listening to the radio. But if that was for the rest of the audio catalog, that could be quite problematic, because people will start to attribute that content to Amazon and to Alexa and not to us. Another major challenge for voice is discovery. You've probably seen this statistic, but when VoiceBot asks people how they discover content on smart speakers, the number one result was, I don't. I just use whatever I knew about already. So that's clearly a problem we need to solve. And another one is engagement, and that's a little bit tied to the discovery piece, is that actually people are still doing the same old stuff that they were doing 3-4 years ago, 5 years ago when the thing launched. They are just doing listening to streaming music, checking the weather, asking a few questions, setting an alarm, setting a timer for eggs or something. If you're interested in a bit more about what we've been up to, we've published a couple of things on how to design. So we have a thing called BBC GEL, which is stands for Guideline Experience, Global Experience Language. So we've created one of those for voice. You can look that up. BBC R&D have created top tips from UK producers of voice. We brought together lots of people from the UK voice community and published a report on that. And we have a technology and creativity blog that you can check out as well. So just quickly, because I'm running out of time, around the future, the things that we are really focusing on now is to make that conversation better, but also voice really only works if it's an access point to stuff that is curated and potentially created via AI. So we can't scale Orator or any kind of drag and drop type interface or branching narrative type interface to build loads of content. I don't think anybody can. So we need to find ways of getting the content to be more easily accessed and more driven by data. So one of the key things for us is to look at how we do that with personalization and recommendations. This has a particular challenge for the BBC because we absolutely cannot build filter bubbles. So one of our public service remits is to burst filter bubbles and to introduce people to new forms of content and challenge their ideas. And we need to maintain editorial control because we are a hugely trusted broadcaster, and we can't just let the machines be in charge on their own. But that said, we still need to get you to some content that's interesting and not randomly jump you around kind of random things. So we do need to be able to do personalization and recommendations. We just have to do it in a particularly unique way. The plan is to do that through the thing we're calling universal recommendations. We haven't got time to go into the details, but it's a big drive from the BBC's data science teams. Another one is around discovery of content, and we're looking at different ways we can do that and how we can make conversation better to enable this. And we'd love to do something like, find me something funny with the woman from Fleabag, or find me something that's an action drama that's a bit like Bodyguard, or something like that. So you can give some kind of examples and go and find content like that. If you look on the BBC's R&D website, there are some experiments with how this might work with voice that you can see already. We're also looking at how we build content in different ways to make it much more accessible in either by smart speakers or by other smart devices. And we're focusing on what's called modular content for that. So we build content in very specific object-based ways so that that content that can be rebuilt and re-rendered in different ways based on personalization, based on a conversation, based on the amount of time you've got, or any kind of accessibility challenges that you might have. But just to leave you with this, the kind of overall goal for the BBC in this space is to protect the public sphere and national conversation, which is being lost in the hyper-personalization of the world of AI. Thank you.